Al-Moallem states that Syria is determined to achieve victory over global conspiracy. Our armed forces continue to chase terrorists throughout the country, inflicting heavy casualties among them. Russia announces that they shall never allow anybody to inspect their Syria-bound ships. The West and some Arab countries are instigating the Syrian opposition to fight against their homeland. And 18 demonstrators are wounded in Al-Qutaif with the bullets and gas of the Saudi forces. Good afternoon. Welcome to our news bulletin. I'm Dania Nizam. In a joint press conference with Iranian counterpart Ali Akbar Salehi in Tehran today, foreign and expatriates Minister Al-Moallem said the Syrian people are determined to achieve victory over the global conspiracy hatched against Syria and the Syrian army, adding that the Syrian people will continue facing the terrorists. Al-Moallem added that the talks showed that Syria and Iran share identical views regarding the regional situation and what Syria is facing of global conspiracy, whose tools in the region serve Israel. Al-Moallem added that the Syrian people are being exposed to a systematic media provocation, yet they are steadfast despite the inhumane siege imposed by the USA and the EU countries and the states of the so-called Arab League, which fight the Syrians with their living. Minister Al-Moallem stressed that Syria possesses defense capabilities sufficient to defend each grain of its soil. The Iranian Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Salehi said there is a global conspiracy targeting Syria and the Syrian leadership has worked to meet the Syrian people's demands and completed a series of reforms in pluralism and democracy. Salehi added that the Israeli entity is behind events in Syria, highlighting that some countries are fighting against Syria to weaken its resistance stances. Salehi also stressed that Syria seeks to restore security and stability to the region. The region's countries shouldn't move in the wrong direction because there would be consequences that could affect the whole world, not only the region. Within the context of Russian attitudes rejecting EU resolutions against Syria, the spokesman of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Mr. Alexander Lukashevich, announced that Moscow would never take part in carrying out such resolutions. It would never allow the inspection of Russian ships. The Russian official pointed out that the EU Council decided to start the implementation of the 17th section of punitive measures against Syria on July 23rd. He affirmed Moscow's steadfast attitude of rejecting such unilateral sanctions, which violate the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of sovereign states. They also violate the authority of the UN Security Council in questions concerning the protection and stability and world peace. General Mohammed Ibrahim al-Sha'ar, Minister of the Interior, asserted that our valiant army and wakeful security forces will uproot terrorism in all its forms and restore security and stability to Syria. In an interview with the Syrian TV, he said that nobody should exploit some loopholes to sell themselves to foreigners. We are ready to help such deceived people and to bring them back to the embrace of their homeland instead of leaving them to become saboteurs. General al-Sha'ar called upon those armed persons to come back and not to become fuel for others seeking to deal a blow to the stability of their country. Such fuel will eventually become useless soil. General Sha'ar denied suspicious TV reports about his death in the terrorist explosion that targeted the building of national security in Damascus. He asserted that such false reports were part of the psychological war against Syria. The meeting of the notables and the people of al-Midan quarter in Damascus and the directors of the departments of services concentrated on the necessity of dealing with the problems that resulted from the acts of sabotage at the hands of terrorist gangs. It also stressed the importance of preserving the services and supplying the needs of the people in this quarter. The people called for the urgent rehabilitation of the damaged infrastructure that were targeted by criminal acts. They called for the preservation and maintenance of the electric equipment that bring electricity to some streets. They also called for emergency services to help the people to go back to their normal daily life. The meeting also called for monitoring the prices of foodstuff and the services of bakeries. The people also called for the protection of the distribution of fuel gas and the monitoring of the distributors of the private sector. They expressed appreciation of the protection of the availability of basic materials for everybody, and they pointed out that one aspect of the war in Syria was the disruption of its economy. Everybody should take part in facing and foiling this war and to confront those who exploit crisis for selfish and illegal profits. Security forces and border guards foiled attempts of armed terrorist gangs to infiltrate Syria from Lebanon in the area of Tel Kelach in the Homs countryside. The terrorists tried several times to steal into Syria from this area. The security forces clashed with them, inflicting several casualties and forcing these armed terrorists to escape into Lebanon. Security forces confronted a terrorist gang which tried to storm the building, the party group in Dar es-Azza in the Aleppo countryside. They inflicted heavy casualties within the ranks of the terrorist gang and confiscated their weapons and ammunition. Another unit of our armed forces clashed with armed terrorist groups in the quarter of Salehi in the city. Several terrorists were killed or wounded. The security forces also arrested 4 terrorists who were carrying 2 wounded terrorists. They also confiscated the vehicle which was used by those terrorists. Security forces in Deir ez-Zor chased terrorist gangs that carried out crimes of murder, sabotage and attacks on public and private property. They inflicted heavy casualties among the terrorists. The dead terrorists included Muhammad al-Badr, Muhammad al-Alawi and Wahab al-Khalifa. After the locals called for help, our armed forces raided the hideouts of the terrorist groups in the Ghab area and arrested a number of leaders and members of terrorist groups and caused them heavy losses. An official source mentioned that after the citizens of the villages of Al-Sharna Hosh, Al-Sharna Karnaz, Al-Mughir and Al-Sheikh Hadid gave information about the existence of terrorist groups in these villages, as they were attacking citizens, our armed forces there raided their hideouts and arrested a large number of them. Many of them were also killed or wounded. The forces also destroyed 2 4x4 vehicles carrying Doshka machine guns, seized a large number of PKC machine guns, RPGs, a large number of explosive devices and shotguns, as they seized modern communication devices and satellite equipment broadcast. The armed forces also restored governmental vehicles which have been hijacked by the armed terrorist groups. The competent authorities followed the armed terrorist groups in El Tuena village to the west of Al-Midan castle, arresting some of them as the others were killed. The competent authorities raided a hideout to the terrorists in the industrial city in Al-Salamiya, causing them heavy losses, arresting a number of the terrorists and seizing a large number of their weapons. The Washington Post and the New York Times published the story of the Dutch press reporter Jeroen Orlemaz and his British colleague John Cantle, who were kidnapped by terrorists of various nationalities operating in Syria. However, the clear fact is that terrorists are being protected by the Western states, which are interested in spreading sabotage and chaos in Syria through supporting the terrorist criminals.
The stories of these press reporters are part of the rumors and false reports of the hostile mass media. They told the Washington Post that they were kidnapped by terrorists who came from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Chechnya, and Britain. None of them spoke Arabic. This gives further weight to reports about the existence of terrorists in Syria. The New York Times quoted the Dutch press reporter as having said that the kidnappers came from various countries and spoke English. They obeyed an emir whose identity was unknown. Yet the imperialist states continue to reject and deny the idea that Syria was fighting terrorism in its territory. The imperialist aides continue to give the terrorists money, weapons and political cover inside Syria. What has France done in the case of the murder of the French journalist Gilles Jacquier in Homs? He was killed by armed terrorist gangs. Instead of imposing sanctions on the terrorists, France sent support for these terrorists in order to increase their actions of murder and sabotage.
The armed forces of the Wahhabi Saudi regime continue to suppress popular protests in Al-Qatif. They wounded 18 people with bullets and poison gas. The demonstrators were calling for justice and equality.
For 18 months, events never stopped in Najd, Al-Hijaz and the eastern area, where men and women demonstrate calling for justice and getting rid of the injustice of the Saudi ruling family. The strongest protests continue to take place in Al-Qatif since the detention of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. The director of the area of southern Jazan asserted that the Wahhabi Saudi regime detained more than 21,000 citizens in 1 month under false pretexts. The Saudi regime has turned Najd and Al-Hijaz into private property and forced the country to serve the projects of the West and to implement the Israeli plot of the so-called New Middle East. The Arabs should realize the danger of the Wahhabi extremism hiding in the darkness of backwardness, supported by some GCC regimes, such as the Qatari regime headed by Al-Thani family.
And with this, we conclude our news bulletin for today. For more news about Syria and the region, you can visit our website, syriaonline.sy. God bless you, and God bless our beloved country.